In the last video, we defined a moderate and extreme emission scenario and identified potential analogs from the past that could give us some hints as to what we might expect to happen under these two different scenarios. So this video here is the biogeography part of this topic. We're going to think about how species will respond to future climate change under a moderate and an extreme emission scenario. And I'm going to open this video with one of the points in the summary slide of the last video. When the world changes drastically, there will always be winners and losers. So some species will thrive, other species will not. And we know from very basic biogeography principles that the species can respond to environmental change either by adapting, so through evolution and speciation. Now remember that evolution does not always lead to speciation. You can have evolution occur within a species as well. Dispersal, so species can disperse or migrate to more favorable environments, or species can go extinct. And what I want to do with this video is go through some of the most talked about consequences of climate change and postulate how species may respond to those changes. So let's start with ocean acidification. In the last video, I told you that this doesn't mean the ocean will be acidic, but that it has more to do with the effect of a slight decrease in pH on the availability of carbonate ions in solution. So with ocean acidification, the amount of carbonates in solution is reduced, and the consequence of this is that it will take more and more energy for organisms to secrete and maintain carbonate shells. So right off the bat, we can say that the species that are likely to be most vulnerable to ocean acidification are those species that require carbonate. And from that, the species that rely on those species for food or habitat. So think crabs, sand dollars, sea stars, and more importantly, coral could be very vulnerable. We've already emitted large amounts of CO2, so some degree of ocean acidification is unavoidable at present. Even if we were to halt all emissions now, it will take centuries for marine chemistry to return to normal. Current projections tell us that much of the Southern Ocean will be acidic enough to destroy aragonite by 2030. Aragonite is one type of carbonate mineral. Under an extreme emissions scenario, by 2100, the polar seas will likely be corrosive to aragonite and will stay that way for thousands of years. So we don't know yet which organisms will be able to adapt to acidification and which will not. Lab experiments and the fossil record tell us that even species we might expect to be susceptible could have some ability to adapt. There's lots of work to be done still. Cold water coral reefs in particular, however, are considered to be severely threatened. So have a look at the map of the globe here. So the dots in red, those are warm water reefs, the distribution of warm water coral reefs, and the dots in blue are known cold water reefs. Canada has important cold water reef habitat off the Atlantic coast and also in southern BC. Now we know very little about the ecology of cold water reefs, so already we're starting at a disadvantage for trying to manage them under future warming scenarios. But like warm water reefs, they are important habitat for other marine organisms. Now, cold water reefs are particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification for two reasons. So the colonies are already living at the limit of their environmental tolerances. If you recall, ocean acidification means that it will take more energy to secrete carbonate shells. If energy is already severely limited to begin with, the organisms will have less ability to adapt. As well, the downwelling of currents can shunt carbon dioxide to deeper ocean depths, which means that the problem of ocean acidification could be a vertically stratified one. Deeper oceans could be more affected than shallow areas. So the Eemian interglacial can't tell us anything about what to expect from ocean acidification under a moderate emission scenario. Atmospheric CO2 wasn't elevated during the Eemian. Temperatures were higher because of increased solar insolation. So instead, we have to look to the PETM to understand ocean acidification under an extreme emission scenario. Now, during the PETM, there was a mass extinction of about 35 to 50% of benthic foraminifera. Coral reefs declined rapidly, and it took millions of years for coral reefs to return to the ocean. Interestingly, we know from the fossil record that many calcifiers did manage to survive the PETM. So adaptation among even seemingly susceptible species is certainly a possibility. But the main take-home lesson that we get from the PETM is that we can expect dramatic ecological changes to occur in our oceans under an extreme emission scenario. So the next much talked about consequence of climate change is rising sea levels. As any climate denier loves to point out, sea level change is nothing new in and of itself, though I will argue that future sea level changes will have a particularly dramatic impact on our societies, much more so than in the past. Now, sea levels will decrease during ice ages and will increase during interglacials. So during an ice age, much of the Earth's water will be locked up in glaciers. When the glaciers melt, a lot of that water will end up back in the oceans, raising sea levels. The last ice age dropped ocean surfaces by 120 meters. Now, we only have enough terrestrial ice left to raise sea levels by about half the post-glacial amount. And that ice is mostly locked up in Greenland and Antarctica. Now, as these four maps show here, under a moderate emissions scenario, much of Florida and the Gulf Coast would be inundated. Cities would be lost. Again, we're building right on the coast now, so we have very little ability to adapt to changing sea levels. So, as I mentioned, much of the terrestrial ice is currently locked up in Greenland and Antarctica. So Greenland and then two different ice sheets in the Antarctic, the east and the west. The melting of the Greenland ice sheet could raise sea levels by 7 meters. The West Antarctic ice sheet melting could raise sea levels by an additional 5 meters. Now, we used to think that the East Antarctic ice sheet was stable and that it wouldn't be an important part of the story of rising sea levels in the future. And this is a good example of where the book, Deep Future, that this lecture is based on is a little out of date. So it was thought that Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheet would be the key contributors to climate change. But new research has shed some doubt on this. So the East Antarctic ice sheet may not be as stable as it seems and may in fact have a long history of expanding and shrinking. So this finding indicates that the East Antarctic ice sheet could contribute substantially to global sea level rise as the Earth's climate warms. So the East Antarctic ice sheet locks away enough water that could raise sea levels by an estimated 53 meters. So more than any other ice sheet on the planet. So the East Antarctic ice sheet could be a major player for influencing future sea levels. Now, the other point that climate deniers love to make is that sea levels won't experience this catastrophic, sudden, doomsday-esque rise, drowning people in cities, but will occur very gradually, giving ample time to adapt. This is true to a certain extent, but what will happen with increasing frequency are things like storm surges, such as we get after hurricanes, which can have a devastating social impact. Coastal erosion is also going to contribute to vulnerability to rising sea levels. Coastal erosion is a huge problem in Prince Edward Island, for a Canadian example. So we can be sure that some level of sea rise will happen, and there will be significant human, ecological, and economic costs. Sea levels have risen in the past, but the human population wasn't 7 billion at the time. Now, I made this point in the last video, but I'll reiterate it again here. So in the past, ecologically significant coastal habitats, so think salt marshes, mangrove forests, intertidal mudflats, have avoided extinction during periods of sea level rise by moving further inland, so they change their distribution. This is no longer an option as a result of urbanization. So to pull a quote directly from Kurt Steger's book, we are crushing the world's intertidal habitats against an impenetrable wall of humanity. Now, one point that is made in the book that I find particularly interesting is what happens if we think 100,000 or more years into the future. So if we commit to a certain degree of warming, we also commit to eventual cooling. If we assume that human populations will still exist hundreds of thousands of years from now, societies in the future will have already adapted to the changes that occur as a result of climate warming, what they'll have to deal with is the boomerang effect. So the oceans are going to start to absorb that excess CO2 and the climate is going to start to cool again. So while we're concerned with sea level rise, hundreds of thousands of years into the future, our descendants may be worried about sea level retreat. So coastal and port cities might become stranded inland. New shipping hazards or boating hazards might emerge as the sea levels decrease. Again, this lecture and the book that it's based on is largely a thought experiment, and this is one important aspect of it. What happens if we expand the scope of our thinking further in time? So our third scenario to think about, and a particularly Canadian example, what will an ice-free Arctic Ocean look like? What will this mean for shipping routes, for tourism, fisheries, industry, for polar bears? So when I was an undergraduate, we talked about the opening of the Northwest Passage as something to expect around 2050. So this would be a new shipping route through the Arctic Ocean, through an ice-free Arctic Ocean. And it's astounding to me how much the timeline has sped up since then. So we are losing Arctic sea ice much faster than anticipated, largely due to feedback loops. 2016-2017 stood out in particular for its dramatic drop in sea ice extent. And I'll be honest, I haven't yet looked into updating this to see what 2017-2018 looks like. But anecdotally, this trend of decline in sea ice is continuing. Now, if we're looking into the future, for Arctic sea ice, it's not just the temperature that matters, but the duration of that warm period. That's what's going to influence the extent of Arctic sea ice melt. How warm is it going to get, and how long is it going to be warm for? So for context, a moderate emissions scenario drops us back to today's temperatures in a few tens of thousands of years. An extreme scenario will be hundreds of thousands of years. So this will have implications for the persistence of ice in the Arctic Ocean. Now, polar bears are the canary in the coal mine for loss of Arctic ice. They're very sensitive to declining sea ice. Just like coral reefs are the losers with ocean acidification, polar bears really are the losers when we're talking about a loss of Arctic sea ice. They're specialist feeders. Their feeding niche is intimately connected with Arctic sea ice. So polar bears require high-calorie meals, and they're specifically adapted to feeding on ringed seals. So they have a seal-specific digestive system. And ringed seals will use winter ice for breeding territory. So that's where polar bears will hunt them. So polar bears, if there's less sea ice, will not have access to their primary food source. So they're either going to have to adapt to a new life on land, or they will perish. And extinction is likely to be the result of nutritional effects on reproduction, rather than the dramatic video you get from Al Gore climate change videos showing drowning polar bears looking for sea ice flows. Again, it's largely going to be a nutrition story. But what can historical biogeography tell us? Well, polar bears, we know, evolved about more than 200,000 years ago. So this means that their lineage spans the Eemian interglacial. Remember that the Eemian interglacial period is our analog for a moderate emission scenario. So maybe this means they can survive an ice-free Arctic Ocean. This is doubtful. Much more likely it means that there was some Arctic ice that persisted during the Eemian interglacial. Now, an understanding of historical biogeography, particularly in the case of polar bears, is important for pushing back against a lot of the systematic climate change denialism that exists. So polar bears are connected with climate change in people's minds, and this has sort of put them at the front line of climate change denialism. And denialists will use the fact that polar bears persisted through past warm periods as a way to confuse the issue. So here on this slide, I've grabbed a screen capture of a recent Twitter exchange between a denialist and Andrew Desrochers, who's a famous Canadian polar bear scientist. So, long story short, yes, polar bears have persisted through past warm periods, but they did so with a reduced distribution. So polar bears do need sea ice. So again, the duration of warming is going to be critical for whether or not polar bears are able to persist through the Anthropocene. We're already starting to see southern species from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans expand their range into the Arctic Ocean. So Atlantic seals are moving in, Atlantic cod, orcas are starting to feed in Arctic waters. Diseases can start to be carried from southern oceans to susceptible Arctic Ocean populations. So this is another recent finding that came out in the last few months. So Pacific salmon are being recorded in the Arctic in record numbers now. So species are shifting their distributions in response to climate change in real time, such that we can actually observe it. So this brings us back to our initial question. What will an ice-free Arctic Ocean actually look like? Will we see the emergence of an ecological sweet spot for a productive fishery? We're going to see increased warmth in the Arctic Ocean, increased light during the summer months. We have thawing permafrost, which is releasing nutrients that are eventually going to be transported to the oceans. Is this going to lead to a boon in an Arctic fishery? So again, with climate change, there are winners and losers. It doesn't all need to be negative. A warming Arctic Ocean could mean a more productive fishery and a unique opportunity to learn the lessons of the past to better manage this new fishery. Maybe for once we've learned the costs of overexploitation. But again, what about the 1-2 punch of climate and ocean acidification? We can't take ocean acidification out of the picture. It's going to influence marine food webs. The Arctic is going to become more accessible and you're going to have more development. Could that lead to the release of contaminants to the Arctic to be taken up by fish? So again, it's not just about the changing climate. We have impacted the environment far more than just through our impacts on the climate system. So this is how we end up in a no analog situation. So we can look to the past, we can look to past changes in climate to give us some clues. But ultimately, we need to interpret that in light of the multiple stressors that our activities are creating in the environment. One aspect of an ice-free Arctic Ocean that I find particularly interesting would be the unique combination of open waters and alternating light and dark cycles. So the Arctic is still going to be at a high latitude. You're still going to have 24 hours of darkness in the winter and 24 hours of sunlight in the summer. It's going to be interesting to see what biota emerge in this new ice-free Arctic Ocean, either new or existing. The greening of Greenland. So, the Greenland ice sheet is melting. As the Greenland ice sheet melts, it's going to open up new land for colonization. During the Eemian interglacial, our analog for a moderate emissions scenario, we had 130,000 years of warmth, and only about a third to a half of the ice sheet remained intact during the Eemian interglacial. Future warming is likely to be of a longer duration. So what can we expect this newly exposed land in Greenland to eventually look like? Well, Greenland has warmed in the past. The most recent warm period in Greenland was the medieval climate anomaly. This was largely a European phenomenon, although there we see some evidence of a medieval climate warm period in North America as well. So during the medieval climate anomaly, Norse settlers reported birch woods and willow on the hill slopes of Greenland. We also know that 400,000 years ago we had conifer forests on Greenland. So will the forests of the future look like the forests of the past? We'll have to wait and see. We will almost certainly see new glacial lakes form in Greenland, just as they did after the ice sheets retreated from North America during the Holocene. Melting glacial ice combined with isostatic rebound could create new large glacial lakes. These could be other areas where productive inland fisheries might form. So for those of you who don't know what isostatic rebound is, imagine putting a stack of textbooks on top of a sponge and leaving them there for a week. So the sponge is going to squish down and get smaller and get shorter. So now imagine removing the textbooks. The sponge is going to slowly start to expand again after that weight is lifted, so it's going to grow taller. It's going to rise up again. So ice sheets are the textbooks, and the Earth's surface is the sponge. So the weight of massive ice pushes down on the Earth's surface, and when that ice retreats, the surface slowly rises again. So this is what isostatic rebound is. And it's a long-term process. So in Canada, even now, some parts of the country are still in the process of rising very slowly out of the oceans as a result of isostatic rebound. But just like with the sea level rise example, climate has a boomerang effect. If you look far enough into the future, we have a greening of Greenland, we have new settlements taking advantage of the newly exposed habitable land. Hundreds of thousands of years from now, future settlers of Greenland might be worried about the return of the Greenland ice sheet. So again, there's a boomerang effect. If you have warming in the future, you will have cooling. Now, I've largely been talking about the northern hemisphere in this video. So let's move further south and think about the tropics. So we have less data on past paleoclimates and biogeographical changes in tropical regions compared to the northern hemisphere. But what we do know tells us that precipitation is going to be an important part of the story. And precipitation tends to be much more difficult to model and predict than temperature. We also know from paleoclimate records that 17,000 years ago, Lake Victoria dried up completely. So for reference, Lake Victoria currently contains a volume of water on the order of 2,750 cubic kilometers. So it's very shocking to think about it drying up. But again, it has done so in the past, which means that it's conceivable that it could do so in the future. And it's a little bit worrying to think about what the consequences of that could be today. As a general rule, warming means wetter conditions in tropical regions, and cooling means drier conditions. But there are exceptions, and it's very site-specific. Lake Victoria levels rose during the Little Ice Age 600 to 200 years ago. Again, precipitation is much more difficult to model. And normally what we think, or what we project to happen in tropical regions is just more extreme version of what we have now. So dry areas will get drier. Wet areas will see more extreme precipitation events. But again, there's lots of work to be done to start to fill in this gap about what's going to happen in tropical regions under moderate and extreme emission scenarios. So what about the mid-latitudes where we live? How will Toronto change with future warming, for example? There'll be a change in vegetation. Will we have a loss of sugar maples in the South Central Ontario region? Will we see the continued northward expansion of oak and hickory forests? Again, these are changes that have been gradually happening since the end of the last ice age. Is climate change going to speed that up? Are we still going to have winter skiing in places like upstate New York, or will it become too warm for that? Again, we're sure we can expect shifts in the biogeography of plants and animals. That's going to be dependent on the usual suspects, on temperature, precipitation, soil conditions, etc. So I'm not actually going to answer this question for you, but I'm going to leave it to you for your very own thought experiment. How could you imagine the biogeography of Toronto changing over the next 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years? And an understanding of biogeography, both historical biogeography and an ecological biogeography, gives you some of the tools that you need to start thinking about questions about how the Earth will change in the future, how we will manage our forests in the future, how we will conserve species in the future. So that concludes the course. I regret that we had to finish the last few lectures electronically and not face-to-face, but it's been a pleasure having you all in this course, and best of luck in your future endeavors.